So welcome everybody to Treasure Hunt. I am Carl Skooglund, and hopefully, as you know, we're here to study the teachings of Buddhism's early tradition as they're preserved in what's known as the Pali Canon. Not just to come into a theoretical understanding of these early teachings, but rather to see how we can put them into practice in our own lives. In the last class, we started our exploration of the second sutta within the collection called the Digha Nikaya, which is the collection of long teachings, of long discourses. It's the second discourse in that collection, and it's called the Sāmaññaphala Sutta. And Sāmaññaphala gets translated as the Fruits of Recluseship or the Fruits of the Contemplative Life. Now, the Eightfold Path is the most commonly known version of the Buddhist path, but what this teaching does is present to us elements of the practice that, when they come together, also basically form a path. So it's an alternative or an additional way of portraying the Buddha's path. And we spent most of the last class not actually getting into the content of the teaching, the actual, practice part of it. Instead, we spent a lot of time setting the stage, you might say, which, if you were here, you may remember is actually quite complex, but here's a short recap of that. So the sutta starts us off by setting the scene, which is on the roof terrace of the royal palace in the city of Rajagaha in northeast India. It's a beautiful evening. It's a full moon night. There's a full moon in the sky, and the king, Ajatasattu, is gathered together on that roof with a number of his ministers. It's a gorgeous setting, the sutta describes, but the king is agitated. And the reason, and the sutta doesn't name this directly, we have to understand this just from Buddhist history. The king, as it turns out, has just killed his father, who was the prior king, King Bimbisara. So it's a beautiful night, but Ajatasattu has just killed his father. And then the text quotes Ajatasattu as saying this, as asking this. Is there any recluse or Brahmin, priest you might say, that we could visit tonight who might be able to bring peace to my mind? So the ministers name a number of spiritual teachers that, he might try to visit that evening, but the king rejects them all. And eventually the king's doctor, Jivika, points out that the Buddha happens to be staying outside the city, just outside the city, along with over 1,200 of his followers in a park called the Mango Grove. Well, Ajatasattu gets excited about this, and he and this great retinue of elephants and women he has riding on their backs, they go to the Mango Grove. And when they get there, Ajatasattu approaches the Buddha and is immediately a little dumbfounded, because this great crowd of 1,250 monastics is completely silent, as serene as a calm lake, the text says. Now, what the sutta is doing here is creating pretty dramatic contrast. So on the one hand, we have this murderous king who just rode into the scene with all the clamor and the pageantry of this royal procession. He's gained what he wanted in the material world, yet he can't find a peace of mind. The Buddha, on the other hand, abandoned his search in the material world and instead searched for and found peace within himself. So Ajatasattu asks the Buddha, is it possible to point to any fruit of contemplation that is visible here and now. Now, he's basically asking, what's the benefit of doing what you're doing? Right? And in a way, Ajatasattu has already answered his own question partially, just when he took note of the monastics and how they were as serene as a calm lake. After the king's question, the Buddha asks a counter question. He says, have you asked this question of other teachers as well? And the king says that he has, and the Buddha asks, well, what did they say? Now, this is a part of the text we actually skipped over in the last class, but I want to give just a brief outline of what the other teachers said, because it provides some pretty interesting comparisons between what the Buddha was teaching and what others were teaching around the same time and place. So the king says that the first teacher that he names said this, that if you do bad things, there are no bad results. That if you do good things, there are no good results. In effect, there's no fruit. The point is, with this system of thinking, there's no karma. There's no system of what we sometimes describe as, what goes around comes around. Right? I think that's our version of, what karma is about. The second teacher taught that there's no self-determination. Right? That beings are driven on only by fate and circumstance. And the idea here is that we're powerless. The third teacher taught that there's no result, no fruit of being good or bad, and that when you die, that's the end of it, that the body breaks up and then all the elements return, to earth, air, fire, and water. This is what we would call today, a materialist philosophy. The fourth teacher taught that people are made up of what he termed these psychophysical bodies, and that these bodies, they're impersonal. And they're impersonal to the degree that if you hurt or kill someone, it doesn't matter, because there's no person there to harm. The fifth teacher was actually a well-known Jain teacher, one of the other main schools or philosophies in India at the time. This teacher's name was Niganta Nataputta, and he taught an early version of ahimsa, which you might be familiar with in that Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King picked up on this idea of ahimsa. So it's a radical form of non-harming. Now, the sixth and the last teacher referred to in this one section, outlined by the king, he basically says, you can't really know anything as being ultimately true or false. And then maybe this is akin to what we hear today from postmodern philosophy. That is, there's no objective truth. It's all subjective, non-definitive. Knowledge is really just a hall of mirrors. Now, it's not necessarily to remember, all of this. It might be interesting to some degree, but the point is that there were a lot of ideas flying around. And this doesn't even get into the Vedic practices, of the time, based on rites and sacrificial rituals. So at the conclusion of this summary of other teachings, the Buddha says, well, here's what I teach. Okay, and then this starts us off into the actual content, the actual practice content. And he describes this first step of the path and describes the first fruit of the path in this way. He describes this first step or terms it calls it going forth. Going forth. And the text quotes somebody as making this commitment to going forth, as saying something along the lines of, let me shave off my hair and beard, put on saffron robes, and go forth from home to homelessness. So that's the step to be taken. And here's the fruit. The fruit is that people pay homage to him, rise up out of respect for him, invite him to a seat, invite him to accept robes, alms food, dwellings, and medicinal requirements. And he would be provided with righteous protection, deference, and security. Now, as I said in the last class, this section can be slightly deflating in that, the Buddha is describing some fairly mundane benefits, right? Receiving homage, protection, deference, security. But I think what the Buddha is doing here is pointing out the worldly aspirations and rewards that might get somebody in the front door, so to speak. It might be a gateway to somebody so that they're interested in the more profound parts of the path. And honestly, I treated this first fruit more like a hot potato in the first class and set it aside pretty quickly. And in a way, inserted the aspiration that the Buddha himself had when he went forth. And that was his sense that there's something more to be gained than what's offered in conventional realms of existence. His going forth took place not by searching the world, but instead, his search took place within, with the idea that the answers to our pain are to be found within, and the answers to true satisfaction are to be found within. And the fruit of this going forth, you might say, is that maybe after wandering down some dead ends in our lives, and the Buddha certainly thought he had encountered a dead end in the palace life, the fruit, you might say, is that we trust that we're finally going in the right direction. We may not have come into all of the fruits yet, but at this point, we trust that we're finally going down the right path. And this, you might say, is a Buddhist form of faith. So this morning, I'd like to take us through the next 4 steps. I'm being fairly ambitious. And each one of these next steps has fruits in and of their, in themselves, but they're also leading us somewhere. They're all also taking us to a larger goal, which we'll get to as we proceed through the teaching. The next section, after going forth, is the section on sila, translated as ethical practice, or Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation is moral discipline. And if you happen to have the translation that I sent out, it's near the bottom of page 8. So we find here a version of what's called the Patimokkha, which is a very long list of monastic rules. And one thing worth noting is that this part of the path, the Patimokkha, is not something that the Buddha created out of thin air. Right? Instead, it was developed over time as the Sangha grew and interacted within itself and with the community. It developed as situations came up. This long list, I think it's important to say, is not based on abstract principles. Instead, they were based on and hammered out in the very real, very messy environment of human relations. And some of us who grew up in certain kinds of religious traditions may perceive ethical proclamations with a bit of skepticism, because in the past, those proclamations were a way of saying to us that we can never measure up, and that the appropriate response to having that feeling of not measuring up is to feel guilty about it. Right, so this is one of the complexities of our own karma, you might say, that we bring to this basic fundamental teaching of ethics. Now, the Buddha was very clear that there are very real differences between right and wrong. But unlike traditions in which, unethical conduct displeased external deities, the Buddha focused on how ethical sensitivity, ethical conduct create healthy communities. It creates healthy people. Alongside that, for us practitioners, ethical conduct puts our minds in a position to put the path into play, to really be on the path. One more thing that's important to mention, I think, is that the structure is considered to be a set of training rules or training guidelines. It's a form of training, right? These are skills to be developed. Something that we can get good at. As the text says, this is growth in the discipline of the Noble One, that a person sees his transgression, makes amends, and achieves restraint in the future. And what the Buddha is basically saying with this, what he's basically creating with this, is a healthy system in which, we learn from our mistakes. So in the Bhikkhu Bodhi translation that I sent out, the section on what he translated as the moral discipline, it goes on for about 8 pages. We won't go into this in detail, but I'd like to highlight a few portions that I think you might find interesting and helpful. I do encourage you to read this section on your own, because I think it provides some interesting glimpses into the world of India at the time. While culturally and temporally distant, this list shows how some things actually haven't changed for people a whole lot over 2,500 years. There can be some interesting things. So first, there's this portion in this portion of the text on the moral discipline. It says, when the monastic has thus gone forth, he lives restrained by the restraint of the rules of the Patimokkha. Possessed of proper behavior and resort, having taken up the rules of training, he trains himself in them. Seeing danger in the slightest faults, he comes to be endowed with wholesome bodily and verbal action. His livelihood is purified, and he is possessed of moral discipline. It also says he guards the sense doors of his sense faculties. He is endowed with mindfulness and clear comprehension, and is content. So this paragraph is an introduction to the 4 parts of the path that lead us to being relieved of the 5 hindrances, which is actually the 5th. I think it's the 5th part of this teaching. Being relieved of the hindrances. So there's moral discipline, guarding the sense doors, mindfulness and clear comprehension, and being contented. And this is what we'll try to plow through this morning. So I want to highlight some of the aspects on, I think it's page 8 in the section on moral discipline. It says, and how, great king, is the bhikkhu possessed of moral discipline? Herein, great king, having abandoned the destruction of life, the bhikkhu abstains from the destruction of life. He has laid down the rod and weapon. And he dwells conscientious, full of kindness, sympathetic for the welfare of all beings. So the first thing that the Buddha says in his outline of moral discipline is, don't kill. And, we can get into this later if you want, but I think this is a point at which the narrative could have taken a really interesting turn, given that the king had just killed somebody. But it's the second part of the section that I'd like to focus on, and that is that if we focus on, this next section, we'd be doing ourselves and the world around us a whole lot of good, as the text says about this whole moral endeavor. He dwells conscientious, full of kindness, sympathetic for the welfare of all living beings. So as we're getting ready to dive into this, long list of rules, there's this little collection of intentions that we find right at the beginning, that set the direction that all of the rules take. Now, this intention, this collection of intentions, we might think of, as the keel of a great sailing ship, or perhaps the engine of a train, such that wherever the engine goes, the train cars follow. So continuing on from page 8, he starts us on a list that takes us through page 15. And like I said, I'll just point out a couple things that I think are worth highlighting. It says next, he abstains from taking what is not given, accepting and expecting only what is given. He lives in honesty with a pure mind. We also see that monastics are celibate. There's a section devoted to right speech, which is fundamental to the path. But as some of us who have been around a while know, that this is also one of the hardest things to pull off. But the text says that we abandon false speech. We speak only truth. We abstain from slander. And on the positive side, we become a reconciler, a promoter of friendships. We abide delighting in concord. We abandon harsh speech and instead speak gently in ways that go to the heart. It asks us to refrain from idle chatter. Then there's this key 3-part combination of right speech, which is that we speak what is factual and what is beneficial, and we speak at the right time.
Get over here.
At the top of page 10, we find a section called the intermediate section. And here are just a few things to point out within it. There's this part on abstaining from the use of stored goods, which may sound a little odd, but what this points to is how the Buddha wanted the Sangha to have a very close connection with the lay community. For example, if a monk or a nun wanted to eat on a particular day, they had to go out into the community and collect their meal. And over time, this helped to ensure that the monastic community behaved in ways that the community supported, rather than having food stored up and the other requisites, just dropped off, kept somewhere, which the effect of which would have been to insulate the Sangha from the lay folk. So when you hear that one of the first great splits within the monastic community, within the Sangha, years after the Buddha's death, had to do with the use of stored up goods, it sounds like a very odd thing to be concerned about. Well, this was the issue, trying to keep the Sangha very reliant on the lay community. The idea was to keep the Sangha from building up wealth. Then there are these sections on not attending unsuitable shows. Again, these are monastics, right? Not engaging in games and recreation, not using fancy beds and other luxurious furniture, not embellishing yourself with fancy clothing and jewelry. There's another section about not engaging in frivolous conversations. There's actually a long list of different kinds of fortune telling and magic that the Sangha members were not supposed to engage in. Now, it's not that these latter things are bad in the ethical sense. Rather it's that for the monastics, they distract from the purpose of the path. And for us, as lay people, it can do us some good to every now and then reflect on, whether these types of pursuits, distract us from our most important aspirations. And in the middle of page 15, it ends with what is the result, with what is the fruit of the moral discipline. The Buddha says, "Great king, the bhikkhu who is thus possessed of moral discipline, he or she sees no danger anywhere. Endowed with this noble aggregate of moral discipline, he experiences within himself a blameless happiness." He sees no danger anywhere. Right? I think of this phrase as being a depiction of having a clear conscience. And the happiness is blameless, it is said, in that we did no harm in making ourselves happy. Right? We've not made ourselves happy at anybody else's expense. Now, if being conscientious, kind, and sympathetic, again, are the train engine, then this is the bright red caboose at the end, you might say, blameless happiness. Okay, so we've gone over, so that's sort of my conclusion of the section on ethics, on sila. The next two sections we've actually gone over in class before, so I'm going to spend a little less time on them. But for the new folks, here are the important parts of these next two sections. Bhikkhu Bodhi translates this section as restraint of the sense faculties. You also hear the phrase guarding the sense gates. And here is what the text says. "And how does the bhikkhu guard the doors of his sense faculties? Having seen a form with the eye, the bhikkhu does not grasp at the sign or the details, since if he were to dwell without restraint over the faculty of the eye, covetousness and grief might assail him. Attraction or revulsion might, assail him." And the passage is repeated for the other five senses, the sixth sense, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and the sixth sense being the mind. So with this section, the Buddha is creating a framework in which we're careful. We're conscientious about what we make out of raw sense experience. There's another sutta that I want to point out and spend a little time with. It's called the Chaphana Suta. In it, the Buddha compares the six senses to six kinds of animals. And he sets out a simile in which each of the animals have ropes around their necks. And they're all tied together. All of these ropes are tied together in one big knot at the center. And what happens is that each of the six animals tries to get to its preferred domain. So, for example, the crocodile tries to get to the water, the bird tries to get into the air, the monkey into the trees. And each one is pulling, trying to get to its favorite place. And the point of the analogy is that, we get pulled by the six sense spheres in different directions. Because, for example, the sutta says the eye gets obsessed with pleasing sights, repelled by unpleasing sights. And it's the same situation with the ear and sounds, the nose and aromas, the tongue and tastes, the body and tactile sensations. And then, as we know, the mind gets obsessed with pleasing thoughts, attracted to pleasing thoughts and repelled by unpleasing thoughts. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, this is a very familiar feeling. This feeling of being in a tug of war. Getting pulled in multiple directions by all of the senses. And as we might know, as we might have experienced, we get triggered by the 6 kinds of sense contact. That come to us by way of the external environment. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. But we also get triggered by what bubbles up in our own mind, the 6th sense. And we, because of this, experience what the texts call papancha, mental proliferation. Now, this is a crucial moment in our experience, a crucial moment in our fashioning, in our making of experience. But it's so quick, so fleeting that it can often go unseen, right? So we have these little micro moments of perception in which we're having an initial experience of something. And we also have that initial experience of something and there being a feeling of it being attractive or irritating. Right? So we put a mental label on something. It's irritating or attractive, and then it's off to the races. Our minds start proliferating about it. Now, if we don't catch it, we don't get used to catching this, then in our non-trivial types of contact, say personal relations, when we get onto a subject about religion or politics, we might very quickly add layers of habitual views and opinions, bring in past associations, old thinking patterns. And then, as the sutta says, we are beset by an onslaught of proliferation with respect to past, the present, and the future. Now, this is one of the teachings in the early tradition that gets a really bad rap. Generally guarding the senses, restraining the senses. And of course, these are terms we tend not to like, right? Guard, restrain, it sounds very Puritan, very limiting. But the idea isn't to be harsh with ourselves. I think of it as being more in the spirit of, not letting our inner child run into the street and get involved in things that could cause us harm. And in practice, it doesn't mean avoiding or cutting off sense experience. The Buddha said that if that was the case, then the deaf and the blind would be partway to the goal. So it's not as simply as just avoiding sense experience. Instead, it's about being wise. It's about being careful about what we pay attention to and how we pay attention to it. Now, the last part of the Chaphana Suta, going back to the 6 animals, he finishes this simile by saying that if instead of the 6 animals being tied together by a big rope in the center, that all the ropes are tied together to a wooden post that's driven deep into the ground. The idea here is that the animals would pull and pull and pull on this immovable post and eventually tire themselves out and lie down. And the Buddha says that for us, mindfulness of the body can act like a wooden post. The mindfulness of the body can help keep the 6 senses from getting can help keep the senses from pulling us in random and maybe not so helpful directions. Which is a good segue into the next section, a section on mindfulness and clear comprehension. Okay, and the idea with mindfulness and clear comprehension is to be mindful of our physicality. The idea is to bring the mind into the body, and then to clearly comprehend exactly what it is that we're doing. And here's what the text says. And how great king is a bhikkhu endowed with mindfulness and clear comprehension. Herein, great king, in going forward and returning, the bhikkhu acts with clear comprehension. And looking ahead and looking aside, bending and stretching his limbs, wearing his robes and cloak, eating, drinking, chewing and tasting, in defecating and urinating, in going, standing, sitting, lying down, waking up, speaking and remaining silent, he acts with clear comprehension. Now, this may not sound like much, but when we engage in this practice, it keeps the mind from flying out of the body and getting tangled up in what the six senses present to us. And I think that at its root, it's a concentration practice in that it unifies the mind, rather than multitasking, you might say, or monotasking. Now, this can be used as more of an insight practice in that we can focus on, the how and the why. Why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we looking at a particular thing? Why are we speaking up? Why are we remaining silent? But for this teaching, I think the emphasis is getting us out of the habit of doing one thing and thinking another. Right? Our bodies are in one place, but our minds are in another. You might have heard the Zen story where there's a guy, he searches out a particular Zen master. He wants to learn from him. He finally finds him deep in the forest. He takes off his shoes outside of the master's hut. He walks inside. He bows down to the teacher and begs him, "Teach me your wisdom." And the master looks him over for a while, and then he asks this guy, "On which side of the door did you put your shoes?" And the guy says, "I don't know." And then the master says, "Well, come back to me in a year." Right? And so it's like the master's first lesson is, if you want to learn the great truths in life, start by knowing where you put your shoes. Or for us, where did you put your keys? Where did I put my phone? With this part of the practice, we're creating within us the tendency of the mind to be clear and composed, whatever it is that we're doing. Whatever it is that we're doing, we know what we're doing. We're doing it and we know it. So to start, we become aware that we're going forward and returning. This can be really helpful in that I think it points to all of those mundane moments, those many moments in which we're going from one place to another. Right? Our goal is transitioning from point A to point B, and we kind of get lost in between, lost in the transition. We focus on where we're supposed to be rather than where we actually are. Next, we can become clear that we're looking toward or we're looking away. And, so rather than having our minds fly out toward whatever we're looking at, a person, some object, or again, our phone, we might keep part of our attention within our body. Next, we can be mindful of flexing and extending our limbs, as the text says. And this is basically what's called proprioception, right? So what we call these days proprioception, which is awareness of our bodily position and our bodily movement. It's what athletes become masters at. And we become mindful, so callidly, of wearing and carrying our cloak, robe, and bowl. Now with this, we consider, what equipment, you might say, that we use to keep our body protected and comfortable. But one thing I like to reflect on is, how I might get not just sensitive to the image that my clothes project, but, how I get tangled up in the image I want to project of myself by, wearing particular clothing. Something else that the text says that we can become mindful of is our eating, drinking, chewing, and savoring. So, just to say, I think this goes without saying that, food is huge. It's a huge part of human experience. It's an external object of so much attention, right? Not just in terms of nourishment and fulfilling, our basic needs. As a sense experience, it is one of the primary ways we seek out pleasure, enjoyment, and satisfaction. We use it to relieve boredom. It's fundamental. And, rather than, us denying of all that sort of not necessarily unhealthy pleasure, I think it is good that, if we checked it out every now and then, is that if we took the focus off the food, took our attention off of the sense object, and while we're eating, instead just steadied the mind and became aware that we're engaging in this simple act of eating, because that's the goal of this particular part of the practice, is steadying and composing the mind. We're eating and we know that we're eating. And then there's the flip side, of course, of eating and drinking, which is urinating and defecating. Like I've said before, in Buddhism, we leave no stone unturned. I once had a coworker who said that he potty trained his daughter by locking her in the bathroom with a newspaper, a cup of coffee, and a cigarette, which I don't think is a very good idea, because I think it just encourages the little girl to be distracted. Bad idea. And then there's this idea that, we're mindful of when we lie down and when we wake up, again, staying composed within those activities. The Buddha ends with being mindful when we're talking and when we're remaining silent, when we're in conversation. I've found that it's more doable to keep bodily awareness when I'm being silent, or when I'm listening. But I haven't, maybe somebody else has, I haven't entirely cracked the code on being bodily aware when I'm speaking. That can be a real challenge. So just to sum up this part of the teaching, I think that what it does is, in general, at its heart, counteract the mind's tendency to fly away from, to fly in different directions, to flow outside of our bodies, and provide us instead with this possibility of remaining clear and composed, having the mind be rooted within the body. So the last section that we'll cover today is the one on contentment, which is focused on the needs of food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. Okay. The text here says, "And how, great king, is the bhikkhu content? Herein, great king, a bhikkhu is content with robes to protect his body and alms food to sustain his belly. Wherever he goes, he sets out taking only his requisites along with him. Just as a bird, wherever it goes, flies with its wings as its only burden." I, in a way, regret that I'm leaving this to the last part of the class, and I could see actually doing a whole class on this part alone. But the basic idea that the Buddha is setting out for us is, to keep it simple, keep it light. Like a bird with wings as its only burden. I don't want to sound cynical, but one challenging thing about this one is that so much of the narrative in the society that we live on is based on accumulation. We get so many messages that point us in that direction. And large parts of our economy are based on pointing out to us the things that we don't have. With the idea that if we got these certain things, that we don't currently have, then we would be happy. That's the basic model. Now, if we're not careful, we could spend a lot of time, a lot of our mental, emotional life chasing down this and that thing, this and that experience. There are counterbalancing influences, and in our discussion portion, I'd love to hear from folks who might have worked with gratitude practice, or maybe clued into the decluttering movement. But the basic questions that I think this section is having us consider, is what sort of material supports do I need? And furthermore, are there any material attractions that are distracting me from wiser forms of satisfaction? So that is a lot to take in. I appreciate your patience with that. I'd like to give ourselves a chance to let our minds rest a bit from all that. Maybe now with all of my words, your minds might be a little noisy. So I want to give us a little time to practice. So if you'd like to adjust your posture, take a moment to adjust your posture, if that would help. Let your eyes close again, if that would help. So I invite you to let all of these ideas that I've set out this morning, let them fall away. You can pick them up later again, if and when you like. For now, turn your attention inward. Turn your attention to your inner experience. You might find it helpful to breathe in deeply. Breathe out completely. Breathe in deeply and feel your body. Breathe out and relax your body. Breathe in deeply and know that you're breathing in. Breathe out and know that you're breathing out. Do what you can to bring the mind into the body. In doing these types of things, we give our minds a chance to experience the kind of happiness that comes from the mind being composed, happiness that comes from the mind being peaceful and settled. It's the kind of happiness that we can make for ourselves, within ourselves. Rather than searching the world, searching our external environment for happiness, we look inward. Seeing what we can find, what we can make within these minds, bodies, and hearts of our own. Breathe in and feel the body. Breathe out and relax the body. Again and again. Being happy with this is something we can get good at, something we can make reliable for ourselves, trustworthy. To see if the peace of a composed mind is possible for you right now. So just a few final words to offer, and then we can open it up to questions and comments. But I'd like to point out, if it's not clear already, that all of these types of practice involve mindfulness, in that we bring these practices to mind, right? And then we keep them in mind. And then just like the Satipatthana Sutta had us do, we contemplate them. The Pali word was anupassana. Right? We contemplate these teachings. We roll them over, reflect on them in our minds. And in doing so, we come to clearly comprehend these aspects of our experience. And another thing is that these practices, they don't occupy separate mental silos, you might say. They're not so distinct as they may be presented. They're not exclusive. And I think that as we practice with them, get a little experience with them, we'll find that they tend to mirror each other and they support each other quite nicely. And as we'll see in the next class, they have fruits in and of themselves, but they also lead up to the abandoning the hindrances and the possibility of entering into very composed states of mind known as the jhanas. Those are the next sections in the teaching that we'll get into. So thank you for your attention.